Elizabeth had settled it that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to visit her the very day after her reaching Pemberley, and was consequently resolved not to be out of sight of the inn the whole of that morning. But her conclusion was false, for on the very morning after their own arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. They had been walking about the place with some of their newer friends, and were just returned to the inn to dress themselves for dining with the same family, when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window, and they saw a gentleman and lady in a curricle driving up the street. Elizabeth, immediately recognizing the livery, guessed what it meant, and imparted no small degree of surprise to her relations by acquainting them with the honor which she expected. Her uncle and aunt were all amazement, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstance itself and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened to them a new idea on the business. Nothing had ever suggested it before, but they now felt that there was no other way of accounting for such attentions from such a quarter than by supposing it partially for their niece. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was every moment increasing. She was quite amazed at her own discomposure, but amongst other causes of disquiet she dreaded lest the partiality of the brother should have said too much in her favour, and more than commonly anxious to please, she naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen, and as she walked up and down the room, endeavouring to compose herself, saw such looks of inquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as made everything worse. Please subscribe my channel. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. With astonishment did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton she had heard that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. She found it difficult to obtain even a word from her beyond a monosyllable. Please subscribe my channel. Miss Darcy was tall and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humour in her face, and her manners were perfectly unassuming and gentle. Elizabeth, who had expected to find in her as acute and unembarrassed an observer as ever Mr. Darcy had been, was much relieved by discerning such different feelings. Please subscribe my channel. They had not been long together before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, but had she still felt any, it could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He inquired in friendly though general way after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good-humoured ease that he had ever done. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner he was scarcely a less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him. The whole party before them indeed excited a lively attention. The suspicions which had just arisen on Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observation towards each with an earnest, though guarded, inquiry, and they soon drew from those inquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensations they remained a little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with an admiration was evident enough. Please subscribe my channel. Elizabeth on her side had much to do. She wanted a certain feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own and to make herself agreeable to all, and in the latter object where she feared most to fail, she was most sure of success, for those to whom she endeavoured to give pleasure were prepossessed in her favour. Bingley was ready, Georgiana was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. In seeing Bingley, her thoughts naturally flew to her sister, and oh, how ardently did she long to know whether any of his were directed in a like manner. Sometimes she could fancy that he talked less than on former occasions, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that as he looked at her he was trying to trace a resemblance, but though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behaviour to Miss Darcy, who had been set up as a rival of Jane. No look appeared on either side that spoke particular regard. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. Please subscribe my channel. On this point she was soon satisfied, and two or three little circumstances occurred ere they parted, which in her anxious interpretation denoted a recollection of Jane, not until by tenderness and the wish of saying more that might lead to the mention of her. Had he dared, he observed to her at a moment when the others were talking together, and in a tone which had something of real regret, that it was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing her, and before she could reply, he added, "It is about 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." Please subscribe my channel. Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact, and he afterwards took occasion to ask her, "Please subscribe my channel," when unattended, to buy any of the rest, whether all her sisters were at Longbourn. There was no much in the question nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whenever she did catch a glimpse she saw an expression of general complaisance, and in all that he said she heard an accent so far removed from hauteur or disdain of his companions, as convinced her that the improvement of manners which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary its existence might prove, that at least outlived one day when she saw him um, thus seeking the acquaintance and courting the good opinion of people with whom any intercourse a few months ago would have been a disgrace, when she saw him thus civil not only to herself but to the very relations whom he had openly disdained, and recollected their last lively scene in Hansford Parsonage, the difference, the change was so great and struck so forcibly on her mind that she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible. Never even the company of his dear friends in Netherland, or his dignified relations on Rosings, had she seen him so desirous to please, so free from self-consequence or unbending reserve as now, when no importance could result from the success of his endeavours, and when even the acquaintance of those to whom his attentions were addressed would draw down the ridicule and censure of the ladies both of Netherfield and Rosings. Please subscribe my channel. Their visitors sat with them above half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley before they left the country. Miss Darcy, though with a diffidence which marked her little in the habit of giving invitations, readily obeyed. Miss Gardiner looked at her niece, desirous of knowing how she whom the invitation most concerned felt disposed as to its acceptance, but Elizabeth had turned away her head, presuming, however, that his studied avoidance spoke rather a momentary embarrassment than any dislike of the proposal, and seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, perfect willingness to accept it, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on. Please subscribe my channel. Bingley expressed great pleasure in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having still a great deal to say to her, and many inquiries to make after all the Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, constructing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and on this account, as well as some others, found herself, when their visitors left them, capable of considering the last half hour with some satisfaction, though while it was passing the enjoyment of it had been little, eager to be alone and fearful of inquiries or hints from her uncle and aunt. She stayed with them only long enough to hear their favourable opinion on Bingley and then hurried away to dress. Please subscribe my channel. But she had no reason to fear Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. It was evident that she was much better acquainted with Mr. Darcy than they had before any idea of. It was evident that he was very much in love with her. They saw much to interest, but nothing to justify inquiry. Of Mr. Darcy it was now a matter of anxiety to think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings and his servant's report without any reference to any other account, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known would not have recognised it for Mr. Darcy. There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and they soon became sensible that the authority of a servant who had known him since he was 4 years old, and whose own manners indicated respectability, was not to be hostile rejected. Neither had anything occurred in the intelligence of their Lambton friends that could materially lessen its weight. They had nothing to accuse him of but pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it would certainly be imputed by the inhabitants of a small market town where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man, and did much good among the poor. Please subscribe my channel. With respect to Wickham, the traveller soon found that he was not held there in much estimation, for though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patron were imperfectly understood, it was yet a well-known fact that, on his quitting Derbyshire, he had left many debts behind him, which Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening, though as it passed it seemed long, was not long enough to determine her feelings towards one in the mansion, and she lay awake 2 whole hours endeavouring to make them out. She certainly did not hate him, though hatred had vanished long ago, and she had almost as long been ashamed of ever feeling a dislike against him that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though at first unwillingly admitted, had for some time ceased to be repugnant to her feelings, and it was now heightened into somewhat of a friendlier nature by the testimony so highly in his favour, and bringing forward his disposition in so amiable a light which yesterday had produced but above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting him and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. He who she had been persuaded would avoid her as his greatest enemy seemed on his accidental meeting most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard or any peculiarity of manner where their two selves only were concerned, was soliciting the good opinion of her friends and to making her known to his sister. Such change in a man of so much pride excited not only astonishment but gratitude, for to love, ardent love it must be attributed, and as such its impression on her was of sort of encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him, she felt a real interest in his welfare, and she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend upon herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power which her fancy told her she still possessed of bringing on the renewal of his addresses. It had been settled in the evening between the aunt and niece that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy's in coming to them on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, for she had reached it only to a late breakfast, ought to be imitated, though it could not be equalled by some exertion of politeness on their side, and consequently that it would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. They were therefore to go. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had very little to say. In reply, Mr. Gardiner left them soon after breakfast. The fishing scheme had been renewed the day before, and a positive engagement made of his meeting some of the gentlemen at Pemberley by noon. Please subscribe my channel. Chapter 3. Convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, she could not help feeling how very unwelcome her appearance at Pemberley must be to her, and was curious to know with how much civility on that lady's side the acquaintance would now be renewed. On reaching the house, they were shewn through the hall into the saloon, whose northern aspect rendered it delightful for summer, its windows opening to the ground admitted a most refreshing view of the high wooded hills behind the house, and of the beauty oaks and Spanish chestnuts which were scattered over the intermediate lawn. In this room they were received by Miss Darcy, who was sitting there with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and the lady with whom she lived in London. Georgiana's reception of them was very civil, but attended with all that which, though proceeding from shyness and the fear of doing wrong, would easily give to those who felt themselves inferior. The belief of her being proud and reserved, Mr. Gardiner and her niece, however, did her justice and pitied her. By Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley they were noticed only by a courtesy, and on their being seated, a pause awkward as much pause must always be succeeded for a few moments. Please subscribe my channel. He had been some time with Mr. Gardiner, who with 2 or 3 other gentlemen from the house was engaged by the river, and had left him only on learning that the ladies of the family intended a visit to Georgiana that morning. No sooner did he appear then Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly easy and unembarrassed, a resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, and that there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behaviour when he first came into the room. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her fan face whenever she spoke to one of his objects, for jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded as much as possible every attempt at conversation on their side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise. Please subscribe my channel. How very ill Eliza Bonnet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy, she cried. I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. She's grown so brown and coarse. Louisa and I ever agreeing that we should not have known her again. However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alternation than her being rather tanned, no miraculous consequence of traveling in the summer. Please subscribe my channel. For my own part, she rejoined, I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her nose wants character. There is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but not out of the common way. And as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine, I never could perceive anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all, and in her air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable. Please subscribe my channel. Persuaded as Missy Bingley was, Darcy admired Elizabeth. This was not the best method of recommending herself, but angry people are not always wise, and in seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, he continued, I remember when we first knew her in Hertfordshire, how amazed we all were to find that she was a reputed beauty, and particularly recollect your saying one night after she had been dining at us, was she a beauty? I should as soon call her mother wit. But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time. Yes, Blood Darcy, who could contain himself no counter, but that was only when I first knew her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance. Look at that. He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talked of all that had occurred during their visit as they returned, except what had particularly interested them both. The looks and behaviour of everybody they had seen were discussed, except of the pastor who had mostly engaged their attention. They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit, of everything but himself. Yet Elizabeth was longing to know what Mr. Gardiner thought of him, and Mrs. Gardiner would have been highly gratified by her niece beginning the subject. Please subscribe my channel. I have been thinking it over again, Elizabeth, said her uncle, as they drove from the town, and really upon serious consideration, I am much more inclined than I was to judge as your elder sister does of the matter. It appears to me so very unlikely that any young man should form such a design against a girl who is by no means unprotected or friendless, and who was actually staying in his colonel's family, that I am strongly inclined to hope the best. Could he expect that her friends would not stop forward? Could he expect to be noticed again by the regiment after such an effort of Colonel Foster? His temptation is not adequate to the risk. Please subscribe my channel. Do you really think so? Cried Elizabeth, brightening up for a moment. Upon my word, said Mrs. Gardiner, I begin to be of your uncle's opinion. It is really too great a violation of decency, honor, and interest for him to be guilty of it. I cannot think so very ill of Wickham. Can you yourself, Lizzie, so wholly give him up as to believe him capable of it? Not perhaps of neglecting his own interest, but of every other neglect I can believe him capable. If needed, it should be If needed, it should be so, but they dare not hope it. Why should they not go on to Scotland if that had been the case? In the first place, replied Mr. Gardiner, there is no absolute proof that they are not going to Scotland. Oh, but there Removing from the chase into a hanky coach is much a presumption, and besides, no traces on them were to be found on the Barnet Road. So, well then, supposing them to be in London, they may be there, though for the purpose of concealment, for no more exceptionable purpose. It is not likely that money should be very abundant on either side, and it might be that they could be more economically, though less expeditiously, buried in London than in Scotland. But why all this secrecy? Why any fear of detection? Why must your marriage be private? As soon as they were gone, Elizabeth walked out to recover her spirits, or in other words, to dwell without interruption on those subjects as might detain them more. Mr. Darcy's behaviour astonished and vexed her. Why, if he came only to be silent, grave and indifferent, said she, did he come at all? She could settle it in no way that gave her pleasure. He could be still amiable, still pleasing to my uncle and aunt when he was in town, and why not to me? If he fears me, why come I hither? If he no longer cares for me, why silence? He's a man. I will think no more about him. Her resolution was for a short time involuntarily kept by the approach of her sister, who joined her with cheerful look, which shewed her better satisfied with their visitors than Elizabeth. Now, said she, that the first meeting is over, but I'm not interested in this conversation anymore. Happy for all her material feelings was the day on which Miss Bennet got rid of her two most deserving daughters. With what delighted pride she afterwards visited Mr. Bingley and talked to Mrs. Darcy may be guessed. I wish I could say, for sake of her family, that the accomplishment of her earnest desire in the establishment of so many of her children produced so happy an effect as to make her sensible, amiable, well-informed woman for the rest of her life, though perhaps it was lucky for her husband, who might not have relished domestic felicity in so unusual a form, but that she still was occasionally nervous and invariably silly. Mr. Bennet, his second daughter, exceedingly his affection for her, drove him oftener from home than anything else could do. He delighted in going to Pemberley, especially when he was least expected. Mr. Bingley and Jane remained at Netherland only 12 months 12 months so near vicinity to her mother and marital relations was not desirable even to his easy-tempered or her affectionate heart. The darling wish of his sister was then gratified. He bought an estate in the neighborhood country to Derbyshire, and Jane and Elizabeth, in addition to every other source of happiness, were within 30 miles of each other. Kitty, to her very material advantage, spent the chief of her time with her two elder sisters in society superior to what she had growingly known. Her improvement was great. She was not of so ungovernable a temper as Lydia, and remarked from the influence of Lydia's example, she became by proper attention and management less irritable, less ignorant, and less insipid from the further disadvantage of Lydia's society. She was, of course, carefully kept, and through Mr. Wickham frequently invited her to come and play with her, with the promise of both and young man. Her father would never consent to her going. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and she was necessarily drawn from the pursuit of accomplishment by Mrs. Bennet. Being quite unable to sit alone, Mary was obliged to mix more with the world, but she could still moralize over every important visit, and as she was no longer mortified by comparisons between her sister's beauty and her own, it was suspected by her father that she submitted to the change without more reluctance. As for Wickham and Lydia, their characters suffered no revolution from the marriage of her sisters. He bore with philosophy the conviction that Elizabeth must now become acquainted with whatever of his ingratitude and falsehood had before been unknown to her, and in spite of everything was not wholly without hope that Darcy might yet be prevailed on to make his fortune. The congratulatory letter which Elizabeth received from Lydia on her marriage explained to her that by his wife at least, if not by himself, such a hope was cherished. The letter was not to this effect: "My dear Lisa, wish you joyful and my dear health as well as very my dear Wickham, you must be very happy. It is a great comfort to have you so rich, and while you have nothing else to do, I hope you will think of us. I am sure Wickham would like a place at court very much, and I do not think we shall have quite money enough to live upon without some help, and a place would do of about 300 or 400 a year. But do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it. If you do, had rather not." Elizabeth had much rather not. She endeavoured in her answer to put an end to every interest expression. Secondary provisional deal with the question of his third thing and the end. I don't think that final was satisfying, and to be honest, I really didn't like the book. I would not recommend it to anybody. Thanks for watching me. Have a nice day. Goodbye. Please subscribe my channel.